The October rain drummed against the tall windows of Whitmore House with the persistence of an unwelcome creditor, but within the opulent drawing-room the assembled guests paid it no heed. Tonight was the culmination of months of anticipation, the unveiling of Sir Geoffrey Whitmore's latest acquisition, a portrait that had been the subject of considerable speculation in London's art circles. Sir Geoffrey himself stood before the shrouded canvas, a man of 60 whose considerable fortune had been built upon an unerring eye for both art and opportunity. His silver hair was immaculately groomed, his evening dress impeccable, and his manner bore the quiet confidence of one accustomed to being the center of attention. The portrait behind him, draped in burgundy velvet, dominated the north wall of the room like a silent sentinel. Among the carefully selected guests, tensions simmered beneath the veneer of polite society. Lady Margaret Whitmore, Geoffrey's wife of 3 years, moved gracefully through the room in sapphire silk, her beauty as striking as it was calculated. At 35, she was nearly half her husband's age, a fact that had provided London's gossips with considerable ammunition since their marriage. Her smile was perfect, her manners flawless, yet those who knew her well detected a certain brittleness in her composure tonight. Near the fireplace, Dr. James Pemberton adjusted his spectacles as he studied the room with the methodical attention of a man accustomed to observing human nature. As the family physician, he had attended the Whitmores for over a decade, and his presence tonight was both professional and personal. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much of life's darker aspects, and his eyes held a wariness that suggested he anticipated trouble. Vincent Carstairs, Sir Geoffrey's longtime rival in the art world, occupied a chair near the window, his lean frame radiating barely contained animosity. The two men had been competitors for nearly 20 years, their rivalry extending far beyond mere business into personal territory. Carstairs had openly coveted the portrait that would soon be revealed, and his presence tonight was both a courtesy and a challenge. Geoffrey always did have a talent for acquiring what others desired most. Carstairs murmured to his companion, Miss Helen Ashford, the art critic whose reviews could make or break a collection's reputation. Miss Ashford, a sharp-featured woman of 40 with intelligent grey eyes, merely nodded, her attention focused on the dynamics of the room rather than its decor. Professor Edmund Hartwell, the distinguished art historian from Cambridge, stood quietly near the portrait, his scholarly demeanor masking a keen interest in the evening's proceedings. He had been instrumental in authenticating the work, though rumors persisted that his initial assessment had been less than enthusiastic. His presence tonight lent credibility to Sir Geoffrey's acquisition, yet something in his manner suggested unease. Sir Geoffrey raised his hand, and the murmur of conversation gradually subsided. "My dear friends," he began, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command, "tonight we witness the return of a masterpiece to public view. The Merchant's Daughter by Antonio Valdez has been lost to the world for over 2 centuries. Through considerable effort and expense, I have secured not only its acquisition, but also its restoration to its former glory." He gestured toward a small crystal decanter on the side table, from which he poured a measure of amber liquid into a cut-glass tumbler. "Before we proceed with the unveiling, I must take my evening medication, Dr. Pemberton's orders, I'm afraid. Age brings its own requirements." Dr. Pemberton nodded gravely. "The heart condition requires strict adherence to the prescribed schedule, Geoffrey. The digitalis must be taken precisely at 9 o'clock. Sir Geoffrey raised the glass, his eyes gleaming with anticipation, to art, to beauty, and to the triumph of persistence over adversity. He drained the contents in a single draught, then set the glass down with a satisfied smile. Moving to the velvet cord that would reveal his prize, Sir Geoffrey grasped it firmly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I give you The Merchant's Daughter." The velvet fell away with a whisper, revealing a portrait of extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship. A young woman gazed out from the canvas with eyes that seemed to hold secrets, her Renaissance costume rendered in exquisite detail. The assembled guests gasped in appreciation, their earlier tensions momentarily forgotten in the face of such artistry. It was then that Sir Geoffrey's triumphant expression began to change. A slight tremor passed through his hands, followed by a look of confusion that quickly transformed into alarm. His face, flushed with excitement moments before, grew pale and drawn. "Geoffrey?" Lady Margaret moved toward him, concern replacing her practiced composure. Sir Geoffrey pressed a hand to his chest, his breathing becoming labored. "Something's wrong," he gasped, staggering backward. The color drained from his face with alarming rapidity, and his legs gave way beneath him. Dr. Pemberton was at his side instantly, his medical training overriding social convention. He felt for a pulse, checked the pupils, and listened to the heart with growing alarm. The bitter almond scent that began to permeate the air told its own story to those who recognized it. "Call for an ambulance immediately," Dr. Pemberton commanded, though his tone suggested it was already too late. "And summon the police. Sir Geoffrey has been poisoned." The word hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming the elegant gathering into something far more sinister. As Sir Geoffrey drew his final breath beneath the watchful eyes of the portrait he had so coveted, the assembled guests began to regard each other with dawning suspicion. The crystal tumbler sat empty on the side table, its contents having delivered death instead of medicine. Yet the decanter from which Sir Geoffrey had poured showed no signs of tampering, and no one had approached the table during the evening's proceedings. As the October storm intensified outside, Whitmore House became a prison for its occupants. Someone among them had committed murder with impossible precision under the watchful eyes of a dozen witnesses in a room where every movement had been observed. The portrait of the merchant's daughter gazed down upon the scene with painted eyes that seemed to hold judgment, her Renaissance beauty now a silent witness to a very modern crime. The stage was set for a mystery that would require the most brilliant of minds to unravel, a mind that even now might be preparing to answer the call that would soon come from Scotland Yard. In the growing darkness of the London night, as the rain continued its relentless assault and the first police constables made their way through the storm-swept streets, the guests of Whitmore House waited in uneasy silence, each harboring secrets that would soon be exposed to the penetrating gaze of Belgium's most famous detective. The bitter almond scent lingered in the drawing-room like an accusation as the assembled guests stood frozen in tableau, each face a study in shock and dawning suspicion. Lady Margaret remained beside her husband's still form, her sapphire gown a splash of color against the somber scene, though her composure had returned with remarkable swiftness. The tremor in her hands had ceased, and something almost calculating flickered behind her grief-stricken expression. Dr. Pemberton straightened slowly, his medical bag clutched with white knuckles. "There can be no doubt, I'm afraid. The symptoms, the odor, hydrocyanic acid, administered in sufficient quantity to cause almost instantaneous death." His weathered face bore the grim satisfaction of a diagnosis confirmed, though his eyes held a deeper unease as they swept the circle of witnesses. Within 20 minutes, the sound of motor cars crunching over the gravel drive announced the arrival of Scotland Yard. Inspector Japp entered with his characteristic brisk efficiency, rain droplets still clinging to his coat as he surveyed the scene with practiced eyes. Behind him came Sergeant Kemp and 2 constables, their presence immediately transforming the elegant drawing-room into something far more sinister. "Right then," Japp announced, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "No one leaves these premises until we've sorted this business out properly. Dr. Pemberton, I take it you can confirm the cause of death?" "Cyanide poisoning, Inspector. Swift and certain. Sir Geoffrey consumed it in that glass there." He gestured toward the crystal tumbler, still resting innocuously on the side table beside its matching decanter. Japp approached the table with careful deliberation, noting the undisturbed arrangement, the absence of any obvious tampering. And this decanter, who had access to it? Pierce, the butler, stepped forward with the measured dignity of long service. I placed it there myself at 8:30, sir, as was Sir Geoffrey's custom. The key to the cellaret never leaves my person. He produced a brass key from his waistcoat with the solemnity of a sacred ritual. The glass, polished by the housemaid and set ready for Sir Geoffrey's evening medication. No one else was to touch it. Those were my explicit instructions. Vincent Carstairs, who had remained unnaturally still throughout the proceedings, finally spoke with characteristic sardonic wit. Rather convenient timing, wouldn't you say, Inspector? Geoffrey manages to poison himself just as he unveils his latest questionable acquisition. His eyes flicked toward the portrait with undisguised contempt. Miss Ashford's sharp gaze moved between Carstairs and Lady Margaret with journalistic precision. We all witnessed Sir Geoffrey pour from that decanter himself. No one approached the table during his speech, and yet— She left the implication hanging in the air like smoke. Professor Hartwell adjusted his spectacles nervously, his scholarly composure cracking under the weight of suspicion. This is monstrous. Geoffrey may have had his rivals, but murder? Over a painting? His voice carried the bewilderment of a man whose world of academic discourse had suddenly turned deadly. Inspector Japp began his preliminary questioning with methodical thoroughness, but each interview only deepened the mystery. Every witness confirmed the same impossible sequence of events. Sir Geoffrey had poured his own drink, spoken his toast, consumed the contents, and died within minutes. Yet no one had approached the table, no one had tampered with the decanter, and the poison had somehow materialized as if by supernatural intervention. It was then that a slight commotion in the hallway announced a new arrival. Pierce appeared in the doorway, his usual composure slightly ruffled by the extraordinary circumstances. "Inspector Japp, sir, there is a gentleman to see you, a Monsieur Poirot. He says you will know the name." Japp's expression shifted from irritation to grudging acceptance. "Poirot. Well, I suppose it was inevitable. Show him in, Pierce." The man who entered was small and precise, his appearance immaculate despite the October storm raging outside. Hercule Poirot removed his coat with careful attention to its proper hanging, adjusted his tie with mathematical precision, and surveyed the room with eyes that missed nothing. His famous mustaches bristled slightly as he took in the scene, the portrait, the grieving widow, the suspicious guests, and finally, the evidence table with its crystal accusers. "Mes amis," he said softly, his accent lending gravity to the simple words, "I perceive that death has visited this house in most peculiar circumstances. Inspector Japp, you will permit that I observe." "Observe all you like, Monsieur Poirot, but this one's got me properly stumped. Impossible crime, if ever there was one." Poirot's eyes gleamed with the light of intellectual challenge as he began his careful examination of the scene, his little grey cells already working to unravel the threads of deception that bound this most perplexing mystery. Poirot approached the scene with the deliberate precision of a master craftsman examining a flawed mechanism. His small hands remained clasped behind his back as he studied the crystal decanter, his head tilting slightly as if the evidence might whisper its secrets to him alone. The bitter almond scent had begun to dissipate, but something else lingered, a faint, almost sweet odor that most would dismiss as inconsequential. "Most curious," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the rain still drumming against the windows. "Inspector Japp, you have examined this decanter thoroughly, oui?" "Clean as a whistle, Monsieur Poirot. No residue, no foreign substances. The poison wasn't in there when Sir Geoffrey poured. I'd stake my career on it." Poirot nodded slowly, his green eyes moving methodically from the table to Sir Geoffrey's still form, then to each face in turn. His gaze lingered on Lady Margaret, who had composed herself with remarkable efficiency for a woman who had just witnessed her husband's death. Her hands, which had trembled during the initial shock, now rested calmly in her lap. "Madame Whitmore," Poirot said gently, approaching with a deferential bow. This evening must be most distressing. Your husband, he followed his medication routine precisely, always." Lady Margaret's voice remained steady, though appropriately subdued. "Geoffrey was obsessively punctual about everything, Monsieur Poirot. 9 o'clock exactly, every evening for 3 months. Dr. Pemberton's orders were sacred to him. And you, madame, where did you position yourself during the evening's proceedings?" "I circulated among our guests, naturally, though I did speak briefly with Pierce just before the unveiling to confirm the timing was appropriate." Poirot's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "You approached the side table during this conversation?" "I passed near it, yes. Pierce was adjusting something. The glassware, I believe." Pierce stepped forward with the rigid dignity of long service. "If I may, sir, Lady Margaret inquired about the proper moment for the unveiling. I was ensuring the crystal caught the light properly. A drop of cleaning spirit on the chamois, sir, for perfect clarity." "Ah, the cleaning spirit," Poirot repeated softly. "It has a distinctive scent, perhaps, something reminiscent of pear drops?" Pierce looked surprised. "Why, yes, sir, amyl acetate. It does carry that particular fragrance." Dr. Pemberton cleared his throat with professional authority. "The digitalis preparation was entirely standard, Monsieur Poirot. 15 drops in spring water, measured precisely. I've prepared it myself dozens of times. And the bottle from which you measured, it appeared normal." The doctor's brow furrowed slightly. "Well, now that you mention it, it seemed perhaps lighter than usual. But Sir Geoffrey had been faithful to his regimen." Vincent Carstairs shifted impatiently, his earlier sardonic composure giving way to obvious irritation. "Really, this pharmaceutical discussion is fascinating, but surely motive matters more than method. Geoffrey had enemies enough to stock a small war." Miss Ashford's pen moved rapidly across her notebook. "The insurance alone represents £3 million, Monsieur Poirot. Such sums have inspired murder before." "Indeed, mademoiselle. And you observed the evening's events with professional attention?" I noticed Sir Geoffrey's hand was steady when he poured, less so when he reached for the unveiling cord. Lady Margaret stood precisely to his left throughout his speech. And afterward, when I examined the portrait more closely, I detected that same sweet scent near the frame, quite distinct from the almond odor of the poison. Professor Hartwell removed his spectacles nervously. "The painting's provenance has been questioned, Monsieur Poirot. It disappeared from Vienna in 1938. There have been ownership disputes." "Disputes that might affect its value?" "Considerably. Authentication can be a delicate matter when wartime provenance is involved." Poirot moved closer to the unveiled portrait, studying not the painted merchant's daughter, but the frame itself. A minuscule fleck of fresh gilding dust on the floorboards caught his attention, barely visible, yet significant to his trained eye. "Inspector Japp," he said quietly, "we must preserve this scene exactly as it stands. No one approaches the table or the portrait until further examination." His gaze swept the assembled company once more, noting the subtle shifts in expression, the careful positioning of each person's account. The impossible crime was beginning to reveal its secrets, though the full truth remained as elusive as morning mist. Someone in this room had committed murder under the watchful eyes of a dozen witnesses, and Hercule Poirot's little grey cells were already working to unravel the ingenious deception that made it possible. Poirot's examination of the portrait frame yielded the first tangible clue in this most perplexing case. Using his handkerchief to carefully probe the upper molding, he extracted a minute sliver of glass, no larger than a grain of rice, along with traces of fresh gold dust that glittered in the lamplight. The sweet scent that Miss Ashford had detected lingered faintly around the frame's lower corner, distinct from both the bitter almond of cyanide and the cleaning spirit Pierce had mentioned. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured, holding the glass fragment up to the light. "Inspector Japp, this suggests a small mechanism was recently inserted into the frame, Perhaps a delicate glass ampule designed to release its contents under specific conditions. The methodical questioning that followed revealed layers of deception beneath the evening's tragic events. Poirot positioned himself in Sir Geoffrey's study, insisting on private interviews where, as he explained to Inspector Japp, the truth, mon ami, often reveals itself not in the shouting, but in the whisper. Dr. Pemberton entered first, his professional composure showing distinct cracks. "The digitalis bottle troubles me greatly, Monsieur Poirot. When I retrieved it this morning for Sir Geoffrey's evening dose, it felt nearly empty. There should have been sufficient medication for another week, yet barely 3 doses remained. And Sir Geoffrey's habits regarding the medication? They were invariable." "Absolutely. 15 drops in spring water, mixed in that crystal tumbler, precisely at 9 o'clock. He was obsessive about the routine." Dr. Pemberton paused, his weathered face troubled. There was something else. Geoffrey mentioned feeling watched lately. He insisted someone had been in his study, though nothing appeared disturbed. Lady Margaret's interview proved equally revealing. Her composure remained remarkably intact, though Poirot detected subtle tensions beneath her controlled exterior. "You were near the side table when Pierce made his final adjustments, madame?" "Briefly, yes. I inquired about the timing for the unveiling. Pierce was polishing the crystal. He mentioned using cleaning spirit for perfect clarity." Her voice remained steady, but her fingers betrayed slight tremor. "I touched nothing, Monsieur Poirot. I merely observed his preparations." "And your relationship with your husband? It was harmonious?" A barely perceptible hardening around her eyes. "Geoffrey was devoted to his collection, Monsieur Poirot. I understood that when I married him. Our arrangement was mutually beneficial." Pierce's testimony added crucial details. "I confess, sir, I made 2 trips to the cellaret, not 1. Lady Margaret requested perfection for the evening's presentation. During my second visit, I also adjusted the portrait's position slightly. The lighting wasn't optimal for proper viewing." "And you were alone during this adjustment?" "For approximately 3 minutes, sir. I used my chamois with a drop of cleaning spirit, amyl acetate, for the final polish of the crystal." Vincent Carstairs provided the evening's most bitter testimony. "I despised Geoffrey Whitmore, Monsieur Poirot. He was a ruthless collector who acquired pieces through methods that would shame a pirate. The Valdez portrait particularly. I had negotiated for it for 2 years when Geoffrey circumvented my agreement with an offer the seller couldn't refuse." "Yet you attended his unveiling." Carstairs' laugh held no humor. "I wanted to witness his moment of triumph before exposing the Gigi painting's questionable provenance. Dead men tell no tales, but living ones can be thoroughly disgraced." Miss Ashford confirmed Carstairs' alibi while adding her own observations. "He remained with me throughout the evening, Monsieur Poirot, but I can confirm that sweet scent near the portrait was quite distinct, almost like a faint perfume, completely separate from the almond odor of poison." As the interviews concluded, Poirot's little grey cells began assembling the scattered pieces of this impossible puzzle. The physical evidence suggested an ingenious mechanism, while the testimonies revealed a web of motives and opportunities. Yet something crucial remained hidden, a detail that would transform the impossible into the inevitable. "Inspector Japp," Poirot said quietly, "we must examine the portrait frame more thoroughly. I believe we shall find that someone has been very clever indeed, but not quite clever enough to deceive Hercule Poirot." The careful examination of the portrait frame yielded the first tangible breakthrough in this most perplexing case. Using his pocket magnifying glass, with the precision of a jeweler, Poirot discovered a narrow channel carved into the ornate molding, so expertly crafted that it appeared to be part of the decorative scrollwork. The sweet scent of amyl acetate lingered within this hidden recess, along with fragments of thin glass that caught the lamplight like scattered diamonds. "Voilà," Poirot murmured with quiet satisfaction. "Here we have our first deception. A mechanism designed to release its contents at precisely the right moment." He extracted the glass fragments with his handkerchief, noting their deliberate placement. But this, mes amis, is not our murder weapon. This is our red herring. Inspector Japp examined the evidence with growing confidence. Looks clear to me, Monsieur Poirot. Someone rigged this frame to release poison when the curtain fell. Pierce was alone with it for several minutes, by his own admission. Pierce stepped forward, his professional dignity crumbling. Inspector, I swear upon my 22 years of service, I touched nothing but the frame's position and polished the crystal with my chamois. Precisely what makes you our prime suspect, Japp declared with satisfaction. You had access, opportunity, and the technical knowledge to rig such a device. Poirot, however, had moved to the crystal tumbler, studying its surface with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. Under his magnifying glass, the apparently pristine glass revealed microscopic scratches along the rim's interior, fresh marks suggesting recent manipulation with metal instruments. More significantly, when he angled the glass toward the lamplight, a faint opalescent residue became visible, clinging to the inner surface like morning dew. The poison was not delivered by the frame mechanism, Poirot announced quietly. It was already present in the glass itself, applied as an invisible film that would dissolve instantly upon contact with liquid. Dr. Pemberton's medical training compelled him forward. But surely such a preparation would be visible. I examined that glass myself when Sir Geoffrey collapsed. Only to one who knew where to look, Doctor. The film was applied with extraordinary precision, a technique requiring both chemical knowledge and artistic skill. Poirot's eyes swept the assembled company with renewed interest. Someone painted death itself onto this crystal, using methods so subtle that even the most careful observer would miss them. The revelation sent ripples of unease through the gathered suspects. Lady Margaret's composed facade showed the first genuine cracks, while Vincent Carstairs shifted uncomfortably, his earlier sardonic confidence wavering. Professor Hartwell removed his spectacles with nervous precision, cleaning them repeatedly. Japp, however, remained focused on his chosen suspect. Frame mechanism or glass coating, Pierce still had the best opportunity for either method. He was alone with both the portrait and the crystal during his final preparations. Indeed, Poirot agreed mildly, and someone was most eager for us to reach precisely that conclusion. He gestured toward the frame's hidden channel. This mechanism was designed not to kill, but to convince. The amyl acetate scent, the gold dust on the floor, the convenient timing, all calculated to direct suspicion toward the faithful butler. Miss Ashford's journalistic instincts sharpened. You're suggesting someone deliberately planted false evidence? I am suggesting, mademoiselle, that our murderer is far more sophisticated than a simple poisoner. They have created an elaborate theatrical performance, complete with props and misdirection. Poirot's mustaches bristled with intellectual excitement. The true killer counted on the police following the most obvious trail, the servant with access, the mysterious mechanism, the incriminating sense. Pierce's relief was palpable, though his professional pride remained wounded. Sir, I would never— Of course not, Poirot said gently. A man who has served with such distinction would not risk his reputation on amateur theatrics. The poisoned film required an artist's touch, not a butler's honesty. Japp frowned, his certainty beginning to waver. If not Pierce, then who? The mechanism points directly to someone with access to the frame. The mechanism points where it was designed to point, mon ami. Our killer is playing a deeper game, one that requires us to look beyond the obvious and examine the psychology of murder itself. Poirot's green eyes gleamed with the light of the hunt. Someone in this room possesses not only the technical skill to create such an elaborate deception, but also the cold calculation to watch an innocent man be accused of their crime. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, but within the drawing room, a different tempest was gathering. One that would soon expose the killer's carefully constructed facade to the penetrating light of Hercule Poirot's legendary deductive powers. Poirot's declaration hung in the air like a challenge, and he could see its effect rippling through the assembled company. The sophisticated nature of the crime, the elaborate misdirection, the psychological manipulation, had elevated this from a simple murder to a battle of intellects. Someone in this room had orchestrated not merely Sir Geoffrey's death, but an intricate performance designed to deceive the finest minds Scotland Yard could offer. "We shall reconstruct, if you please," Poirot announced with quiet authority. "Each person must return to their exact position during Sir Geoffrey's final moments. The truth, mes amis, often reveals itself not in what we remember, but in what we unconsciously observe." The reluctant shuffle of chairs and feet filled the drawing-room as each suspect resumed their place from that fatal moment. Lady Margaret positioned herself to Sir Geoffrey's left, her sapphire gown a splash of colour against the sombre proceedings. Vincent Carstairs returned to his station by the window, his earlier sardonic confidence now replaced by watchful tension. Miss Ashford took her position between the portrait and the hearth, her journalist's eye already cataloguing every detail. Professor Hartwell stood near where the velvet cord had hung, his scholarly composure showing distinct cracks. Dr. Pemberton moved to his observation point behind the decanter, while Pierce assumed his position by the side table with wounded dignity. "Bon," Poirot murmured, his green eyes scanning the tableau with the precision of a master painter studying his composition. "Now we observe not what happened, but what could have happened. Pierce, if you would demonstrate your polishing technique once more." The butler's movements were precise and practiced as he lifted his chamois cloth, dampened with the faint, sweet scent of amyl acetate. But Poirot's attention had shifted to something far more subtle, the positioning of each person relative to the crystal tumbler during those crucial final minutes. "The poisoned film," Poirot continued thoughtfully, "required not only chemical expertise but perfect timing. Our killer knew that Sir Geoffrey would pour his Madeira at precisely 9 o'clock, that he would drain the glass completely, that the poison would dissolve instantly upon contact with the liquid." He paused, studying Lady Margaret's composed features. Such intimate knowledge of routine suggests someone very close to the victim. Dr. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably. Geoffrey was obsessively punctual about everything, Monsieur Poirot. His evening routine never varied. 9 o'clock precisely for his Madeira, then the unveiling. Exactly, Doctor. And therein lies our killer's greatest advantage and their most significant vulnerability. Poirot approached the crystal tumbler, examining it once more under his magnifying glass. The application of the poisoned film required access to this glass, some time before the evening's proceedings, yet after Pierce's initial cleaning. Miss Ashford leaned forward with professional interest. The timing window would have been quite narrow then, between the final preparations and Sir Geoffrey's toast. "Indeed, mademoiselle. Which brings us to a most interesting question. Who among you had both the opportunity and the technical knowledge to accomplish such a feat?" Poirot's gaze swept the assembled suspects with uncomfortable intensity. Professor Hartwell removed his spectacles with nervous precision. "Surely you're not suggesting that one of Geoffrey's trusted friends—" "Trust, Professor, is often the murderer's most valuable weapon. Our killer counted on being above suspicion, on their reputation shielding them from scrutiny." Poirot's voice carried the gentle cruelty of inexorable logic. But even the most careful criminal leaves traces when observed by the right eyes. He withdrew a small evidence envelope from his waistcoat, revealing a single strand of hair, impossibly fine with the distinctive auburn tint that caught the lamplight. This was found adhering to Pierce's chamois cloth, yet it matches none of the household staff. Lady Margaret's hand moved unconsciously toward her perfectly coiffed hair, the gesture lasting barely a second, but long enough for Poirot's sharp eyes to register. The auburn strand, when compared to her dark locks, told its own story of careful preparation and calculated deception. The killer, Poirot continued with quiet satisfaction, believed they had thought of everything. The false mechanism in the frame, the misdirection toward the innocent butler, the elaborate theatrical performance. But they failed to account for one crucial factor, that Hercule Poirot would distinguish between genuine evidence and carefully planted deception. The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the tall windows and casting stark shadows across faces now etched with growing fear. Someone among them was beginning to realize that their elaborate charade was unraveling, thread by carefully woven thread, beneath the penetrating gaze of the little Belgian detective whose reputation for exposing the truth was as legendary as it was inexorable. The psychological game had begun in earnest. The auburn hair strand had served its purpose as psychological pressure, and Poirot could see its effect rippling through the assembled company like stones cast into still water. He pocketed the evidence with deliberate care, his movements calculated to suggest he possessed far more damning proof than he had yet revealed. The killer, he knew, would be watching his every gesture, searching for signs of how much the detective truly understood. The application of the poisoned film. Poirot continued conversationally, allowing his gaze to sweep the room with deceptive casualness would have required not only chemical knowledge, but also artistic precision. A steady hand, an understanding of how liquids interact with treated surfaces, and most importantly, the ability to work under pressure while maintaining perfect composure. Lady Margaret's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap, though her expression remained composed. Dr. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably, while Professor Hartwell removed his spectacles once again, cleaning them with nervous precision. Each reaction was catalogued by Poirot's observant eyes, filed away in the vast library of his little grey cells. It was then that Pierce approached with obvious reluctance, carrying a silver salver bearing a single envelope. "Forgive the interruption, sir, but this was discovered in Sir Geoffrey's private study. The door was found ajar, which is most unusual. Sir Geoffrey always kept it locked during social gatherings." Inspector Japp examined the envelope with professional interest. The wax seal had been broken recently, judging by the fresh edges of the tear. Inside, a single document bore the unmistakable letterhead of Sir Geoffrey's solicitors, dated that very afternoon. "A codicil to Sir Geoffrey's will," Japp announced, his voice carrying new gravity. "Executed at 2 o'clock today, witnessed by—" He paused, consulting the signatures. "Dr. Pemberton and one Mr. Godfrey from the firm of solicitors." Dr. Pemberton nodded gravely. "Geoffrey summoned me this afternoon. He wished to make certain revisions to his estate planning, particularly concerning the art collection. He seemed unusually agitated about legal challenges to some of his acquisitions." "And the nature of these revisions?" Poirot inquired with gentle persistence. The doctor's weathered face showed clear discomfort. "He restricted Lady Margaret's immediate access to the collection and its proceeds. Not from lack of trust, he assured me, but from legal caution. The restriction was to last 6 months while certain ownership questions were resolved." The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. Lady Margaret's carefully maintained composure finally showed genuine cracks, her face paling beneath her perfectly applied cosmetics. "Geoffrey said nothing to me about any legal challenges. Our marriage settlement guaranteed my inheritance rights." "Ah, but madame," Poirot observed with quiet intensity, "your husband was a careful man, no? He would not have made such changes without compelling reason." He turned to Professor Hartwell, whose scholarly demeanor had given way to obvious distress. "Professor, you authenticated the Valdez portrait. Were there concerns about its provenance that might have prompted such legal caution?" Hartwell's hands trembled as he replaced his spectacles. "There had been inquiries, letters from parties claiming familial connections to the original subjects. Geoffrey was concerned about potential ownership disputes, particularly given the painting's wartime history." Vincent Carstairs found his voice, though it carried none of his earlier sardonic confidence. Geoffrey never mentioned ownership challenges to me, and I've been tracking that painting's history for years. If there were legitimate claims, surely they would have surfaced during my own research. Unless, Poirot suggested with delicate precision, someone was working very hard to ensure such claims never reached public attention. His green eyes fixed on Lady Margaret with uncomfortable intensity. "Tell me, madam, were you aware of your husband's afternoon meeting with his solicitors?" "I knew he had appointments," she replied carefully. "Geoffrey often conducted business without discussing the details with me. Yet the timing is most curious, is it not? On the very day he planned to unveil his greatest acquisition, Sir Geoffrey chose to restrict his wife's inheritance. One might wonder what prompted such urgent legal action." Miss Ashford, who had been taking careful notes throughout the exchange, looked up with journalistic sharpness. "Monsieur Poirot, are you suggesting that Sir Geoffrey discovered something about the painting that made him fear legal complications?" "I'm suggesting, mademoiselle, that our victim knew he was in danger, perhaps not of murder, but certainly of exposure. The codicil represents not merely legal caution, but a man's attempt to protect his estate from the consequences of his own past actions." The storm outside seemed to intensify with the growing tension, lightning illuminating the tall windows and casting stark shadows across faces now etched with fear and suspicion. Someone among them was beginning to realize that their elaborate charade was unraveling, thread by carefully woven thread, beneath the penetrating gaze of the little Belgian detective. Poirot moved closer to the portrait itself, studying not the painted merchant's daughter, but the reactions of those who watched him. Our killer believed they had created the perfect crime: elaborate misdirection, careful timing, and the elimination of a man who knew too much. But they failed to account for one crucial factor: that Sir Geoffrey's own precautions would provide the very evidence needed to expose their motive. The psychological game had reached its crucial phase, and Hercule Poirot could sense the killer's growing desperation as their carefully constructed facade began to crumble under the weight of truth. The codicil's revelation had transformed the drawing room's atmosphere from mere suspicion to palpable tension. Poirot could observe the psychological pressure mounting in each suspect's demeanor, particularly in the subtle shifts of posture and expression that betrayed inner turmoil. The killer was beginning to realize that their elaborate deception was unraveling, thread by carefully woven thread. "The timing of this legal document troubles me greatly," Poirot mused, his green eyes moving methodically between the crystal tumbler and the portrait. "Sir Geoffrey executes these restrictions at 2 o'clock, then dies at 9 o'clock the same evening. Such coincidence suggests not chance, but calculated desperation." He returned to the side table, his gaze fixed once more upon the crystal tumbler with its barely visible opalescent residue. The digitalis bottle's unusual lightness, as Dr. Pemberton had noted, now resonated with deeper significance. A substantial quantity had been removed, not merely consumed according to the prescribed routine. Poirot's little grey cells began arranging the seemingly disparate pieces into a coherent pattern. The invisible poison film on the glass, the artist's touch required for its application, the deliberate misdirection of the frame mechanism with its sweet-smelling amyl acetate. Each element pointed toward a killer of extraordinary sophistication and specialized knowledge. "Professor Hartwell," Poirot said quietly, "your authentication of this work. There were irregularities that concerned you initially. The scholar's composure showed visible cracks. The signatures seemed somewhat fresh. But Geoffrey was so insistent, and the provenance documentation appeared legitimate." "Appeared legitimate," Poirot repeated with gentle emphasis, "but was not, in fact, legitimate." Dr. Pemberton stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Geoffrey confided in me this afternoon during our meeting with the solicitors. He had discovered that certain documents relating to the painting's wartime history had been fabricated. He was facing potential criminal charges for knowingly purchasing stolen property." The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. Lady Margaret's carefully maintained composure showed the first genuine cracks, while Vincent Carstairs stared at the portrait with dawning comprehension. Poirot picked up the crystal tumbler again, turning it slowly in his hand. The microscopic scratches on the rim, the faint opalescent film, these were not merely traces of poison, but evidence of something far more sophisticated. His mind raced through the properties of certain varnishes and sizings used in art restoration, compounds that could be applied as an almost imperceptible coating, drying clear, then designed to dissolve upon contact with specific solvents. The sweet scent that Miss Ashford detected, Poirot continued thoughtfully. Pierce attributed it to cleaning spirit, but amyl acetate is also found in certain quick-drying lacquers and varnishes used in fine art restoration. The technical explanation began forming in his mind with crystalline clarity. What if the opalescent residue was a varnish or sizing laced with cyanide, designed to be activated by the alcohol in Sir Geoffrey's Madeira? The poison would remain stable and invisible until dissolved by the wine, creating a delayed-action murder weapon of extraordinary sophistication. Criminal charges would have meant naught, merely financial ruin. Poirot observed, studying each face with uncomfortable intensity, but imprisonment and complete destruction of reputation. A man of Sir Geoffrey's social standing would face utter disgrace. Lady Margaret's hands trembled visibly now, though she maintained her composure with visible effort. "I don't understand what you're implying, Monsieur Poirot. I had nothing to do with Geoffrey's business dealings." "Ah, but madame, I think you had everything to do with them." Poirot's voice carried the inexorable weight of logic building toward revelation. Someone with intimate knowledge of Sir Geoffrey's routines, someone with access to his private papers, someone with the technical skills to create convincing forgeries. The digitalis bottle's lightness suddenly made perfect sense. Some of the heart medication had been removed, not for the poison itself, but perhaps as a component in creating the sophisticated delivery system. The killer had engineered not just murder, but a chemical reaction using art materials as their deadly medium. Vincent Carstairs found his voice, though it carried none of his earlier antagonism. The codicil was the final straw, wasn't it? Sir Geoffrey had discovered the forgeries and moved to protect his estate from legal consequences. Poirot nodded slowly, his understanding now complete, though not yet ready for full revelation. The killer had not simply poisoned Sir Geoffrey. They had created an elegant, insidious method using specialized knowledge, then meticulously crafted false trails to lead suspicion astray. The true method required intimate familiarity with both chemistry and art restoration techniques. "The pieces arrange themselves," Poirot murmured, returning the evidence to the table with careful precision. "Soon, mes amis, we shall gather all together, and the truth will reveal itself in its full, terrible clarity." The storm outside seemed to mirror the emotional tempest within the drawing room, as the killer's carefully constructed world prepared to collapse under the relentless pressure of Hercule Poirot's legendary deductive power. The codicil's revelation had created a palpable shift in the drawing room's atmosphere, and Poirot could sense the mounting desperation beneath the killer's carefully maintained facade. The psychological fortress was beginning to crumble, and it was time to apply the pressure that would force the truth into the open. "Inspector Japp," Poirot said with quiet authority, his green eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a chess master watching his opponent's strategy collapse. "I believe we must examine Sir Geoffrey's private study more thoroughly. The answers we seek may lie not in this room of performance and misdirection, but in the sanctuary where our victim conducted his most sensitive business." The procession to Sir Geoffrey's study revealed a room that spoke of meticulous organization recently disrupted by urgent activity. Papers lay scattered across the leather-topped desk, and a small safe stood open, its contents partially disturbed. Most significantly, what appeared to be a makeshift laboratory occupied one corner of the room, a precision scale surrounded by an array of small glass vials, their contents labeled in the precise handwriting that spoke of scientific methodology. Dr. Pemberton approached the chemical apparatus with professional interest, his weathered face showing recognition. Geoffrey had been experimenting with different preservation techniques for his paintings. He was particularly concerned about the effects of London's atmosphere on certain pigments and varnishes. Poirot examined the vials with growing fascination, his little grey cells arranging the evidence into a coherent pattern. Among the standard conservation chemicals, turpentine, varnish removers, various solvents, were several compounds that would be lethal in sufficient concentration. More tellingly, one vial labeled Prussian blue stabilizer was nearly empty, though the usage notes beside it indicated its contents should have lasted months. Prussian blue, Poirot murmured, his understanding deepening with each observation. A pigment that, when combined with certain acids, can produce hydrogen cyanide gas. But in this case, our killer was far more sophisticated. They created a stable compound that would release its deadly contents only when dissolved in alcohol. Miss Ashford, who had followed them into the study, pointed to a series of technical drawings scattered across the desk. These appear to be chemical formulas and application methods. Someone has been planning this for quite some time, haven't they, Monsieur Poirot? The drawings revealed an intricate understanding of both chemistry and art restoration techniques. The killer had designed a delivery system using a transparent varnish base, laced with a cyanide compound that would remain stable when dry, but dissolve rapidly in the presence of ethanol. Applied to the interior of the crystal tumbler as an invisible film, it would be activated only when Sir Geoffrey poured his evening Madeira. The genius of this method, Poirot explained to Inspector Japp, his voice carrying the weight of admiration for the killer's technical skill, lies in its absolute specificity. The poison would affect only the intended victim, only at the precise moment they consumed their regular evening drink. No risk to others, no chance of accidental poisoning, and the evidence would literally dissolve away with the victim's final breath. Lady Margaret had remained conspicuously silent during this examination, but Poirot noticed her eyes lingering on the chemical apparatus with unmistakable familiarity. When she thought no one was observing, her fingers traced the air above one of the vials with the unconscious precision of someone who had handled such equipment many times before. Vincent Carstairs studied the technical drawings with growing comprehension and obvious unease. These formulas, they require advanced knowledge of both organic chemistry and art conservation. This isn't the work of an amateur, is it? Indeed not, Monsieur Carstairs. Our killer possessed specialized training that allowed them to create both the forged provenance documents and this sophisticated murder weapon. They understood precisely how to manipulate chemical compounds for maximum effect while leaving minimal trace evidence. Dr. Pemberton's medical training compelled him to examine the empty vial more closely. The quantity missing would be sufficient to create a lethal dose, assuming proper concentration and delivery method. But the technical knowledge required, this suggests someone with formal education in chemistry or related fields. Poirot's gaze fixed on Lady Margaret with uncomfortable intensity, noting the subtle tremor that had returned to her hands. Tell me, madame, your background before marriage. You studied at university, perhaps? Her composure, already strained by the mounting evidence, showed visible cracks for the first time. I studied art history and conservation at the Courtauld Institute. My thesis focused on Renaissance painting techniques and their modern preservation methods. Ah, conservation techniques, Poirot repeated with gentle emphasis, including, no doubt, the chemical properties of various varnishes, solvents, and pigment stabilizers, the very knowledge required to create both convincing document forgeries and invisible poison delivery systems. The silence that followed was pregnant with implication. Lady Margaret's educational background provided not only the technical knowledge required for the sophisticated murder method, but also the expertise needed to create the convincing forgeries that had enabled Sir Geoffrey's acquisition of stolen art. Her intimate access to his routines, combined with her understanding of his business practices, had made her the perfect accomplice, until the codicil threatened to expose everything. The psychological pressure had reached its breaking point, and Poirot could sense that the moment for the final gathering was at hand. The revelation of Lady Margaret's specialized education had created a moment of crystalline clarity, and Poirot could sense that the psychological fortress was finally ready to collapse under the accumulated weight of evidence. He led the assembled company back to the drawing room with quiet authority, his green eyes holding the satisfaction of a chess master watching his opponent's strategy crumble. "We shall be orderly," Poirot announced, positioning himself before the fireplace while the suspects arranged themselves in an unconscious semicircle. The portrait of the merchant's daughter gazed down upon them with painted eyes that seemed to hold judgment, her Renaissance beauty now a silent witness to the evening's terrible revelations. Inspector Japp took his position near the door, while the crystal tumbler remained on the side table like an accusation made manifest. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of inexorable logic, "we have witnessed tonight not merely a murder, but a performance of extraordinary complexity. Our killer demonstrated technical brilliance, psychological manipulation, and artistic skill in equal measure. They created not one deception, but multiple layers of misdirection designed to confuse even the most experienced investigators." He gestured toward the crystal tumbler with deliberate precision. The poison was delivered through a method so sophisticated that it required advanced knowledge of both chemistry and art conservation. A transparent varnish film was applied to the interior of this glass, laced with a cyanide compound that would remain stable when dry but dissolve rapidly in alcohol. When Sir Geoffrey poured his evening Madeira, he unknowingly activated his own death warrant. Dr. Pemberton leaned forward with professional interest. The symptoms fit perfectly, the rapid onset, the bitter almond scent, but such technical precision. "Precisely, Doctor. The killer possessed specialized training that allowed them to create this sophisticated murder weapon while leaving minimal trace evidence." Poirot lifted the crystal tumbler, angling it toward the lamplight. "Under magnification, we can observe microscopic scratches along the inner rim, fresh marks suggesting recent manipulation with fine instruments. More significantly, the faint opalescent residue that remains tells its own story of chemical sophistication." "But the murder itself was only half the performance," Poirot continued, his gaze sweeping the assembled company. "Our killer also created an elaborate false trail, the mechanism in the portrait frame, designed to release amyl acetate and create the impression of a different delivery method. They counted on the police following this obvious clue and arresting the innocent Pierce for a crime he could never have committed." Pierce stepped forward with wounded dignity. "The frame mechanism was indeed a deception, sir. I touched nothing but the position and my cleaning cloth." "Exactly as our killer intended," Poirot confirmed. "The sweet scent of amyl acetate, the gold dust on the floor, the convenient timing, all calculated to direct suspicion toward the faithful butler while the true murderer observed from a position of apparent innocence. The application of the poisoned film required precise timing," Poirot explained, moving closer to the side table. "It had to occur after Pierce's final polishing, yet before Sir Geoffrey's toast. There was, therefore, a window of mere minutes when someone with the necessary expertise could approach this table unobserved." Lady Margaret's composure, already strained by the mounting evidence, began showing visible cracks. Her hands trembled in her lap as Poirot's relentless logic stripped away each carefully constructed lie. During the final preparations, when Pierce was adjusting the portrait's position and all attention was focused on the impending unveiling, one person moved with calculated purpose. Lady Margaret approached the side table under the pretext of confirming the timing with Pierce, but her true purpose was far more sinister. The auburn hair found on Pierce's cleaning cloth provides physical evidence of this proximity, Poirot continued mercilessly. But more damning still is the evidence found in Sir Geoffrey's private study, the chemical apparatus that Lady Margaret used to create her murder weapon, complete with her fingerprints on the vials and the specialized knowledge revealed by her educational background. Vincent Carstairs stared at Lady Margaret with dawning comprehension. Your conservation training at the Courtauld Institute, you had access to all the necessary compounds. The irony, Poirot observed with grim satisfaction, is that Lady Margaret's technical brilliance ultimately provided the evidence for her own conviction. The missing digitalis, not used for the poison itself, but as a component in creating the sophisticated delivery system, the varnish base that required an artist's steady hand and intimate knowledge of chemical properties. The codicil to Sir Geoffrey's will, executed just hours before his death, was the final piece of the puzzle, Poirot announced, his voice rising with the weight of revelation. Sir Geoffrey had discovered that the provenance documents for the merchant's daughter, and indeed for other valuable pieces in his collection, were not merely questionable, but outright forgeries created by his own wife. The silence that followed was pregnant with implication as the full scope of Lady Margaret's deception became clear. Lady Margaret had been Sir Geoffrey's partner in acquiring stolen artworks, using her conservation expertise to create convincing provenance documents and her social connections to facilitate sales. When Sir Geoffrey discovered that criminal charges were imminent, he moved to protect his estate through the codicil, effectively cutting her out of the inheritance that represented not just wealth, but freedom from prosecution. Lady Margaret's carefully maintained facade finally began to crumble as Poirot's accusations struck home with devastating accuracy. The elegant society wife was replaced by something harder, more calculating, infinitely more desperate. "You cannot prove any of this, Monsieur Poirot," she said, though her voice carried none of its earlier refinement. "Theories and speculation mean nothing in a court of law." "Ah, but madame," Poirot replied with quiet triumph, "I can prove everything. Your fingerprints are on the chemical vials. Your handwriting matches the forged documents, and most damning of all, the invisible varnish film you applied to the crystal tumbler has left traces that modern forensic science can detect and analyze. The technical knowledge required, the intimate access to Sir Geoffrey's routines, the desperate motive provided by the codicil, all pointing inexorably toward a killer who believed herself too clever to be caught." Poirot's green eyes held Lady Margaret's gaze with uncomfortable intensity. "You created the perfect crime, madame, but you failed to account for one crucial factor, that Hercule Poirot would distinguish between genuine evidence and carefully planted deception." The transformation was remarkable and terrible to witness. Lady Margaret's composure shattered completely, her face contorting with a mixture of rage and terror as the weight of exposure crashed down upon her. "He was going to ruin me," she cried, her voice breaking with desperate fury. "He was going to expose everything, 20 years of work, of building a reputation, of creating a life, all destroyed by his sudden attack of conscience." Inspector Japp stepped forward with grim satisfaction, his handcuffs ready. "Lady Margaret Whitmore, I arrest you for the murder of your husband, Sir Geoffrey Whitmore." As the elegant murderess was led away, her sapphire gown now seeming almost garish against her pale, defeated features, Poirot remained by the fireplace, his little grey cells finally at rest. The portrait of the merchant's daughter continued to gaze down upon the scene with painted eyes that had witnessed the triumph of justice over deception, truth over elaborate lies. The storm outside had finally begun to subside, but within the drawing room of Whitmore House, the tempest of revelation had run its course, leaving only the quiet satisfaction of a mystery solved and justice served. The handcuffs closed around Lady Margaret's wrists with metallic finality, but her composure had returned with chilling swiftness. As Inspector Japp prepared to escort her from the drawing room, she turned back with one final burst of calculated defiance, her voice carrying the cold precision that had made her such a formidable killer. "You think you've won, Monsieur Poirot, with your little grey cells and your methodical deductions. But Geoffrey was a willing partner in our enterprise until his cowardice threatened everything we had built together. 20 years of creating perfect forgeries, of establishing unassailable provenance for questionable acquisitions, and he destroyed it all with one attack of guilty conscience." Poirot regarded her with the detached compassion of a physician observing a particularly virulent disease. "Your technical skill was indeed remarkable, madame. But you made the fatal error of believing that complexity could disguise truth from those trained to perceive it." As Lady Margaret was led away, her footsteps echoing down the marble hallway toward an uncertain future, Inspector Japp returned within the hour with laboratory confirmation that transformed theory into incontrovertible fact. The crystal tumbler contained traces of a transparent varnish base laced with a cyanide, compound designed to dissolve rapidly in ethanol. The frame's hidden channel held only harmless amyl acetate and gold leaf particles. Ingenious misdirection, but entirely impotent. Most damning of all, Lady Margaret's fingerprints adorned 2 crucial vials in Sir Geoffrey's study, while a fine sable brush bore microscopic residue of the same lethal varnish compound. "The digitalis dropper was the final piece," Dr. Pemberton observed with grim understanding. "Not used for measuring medicine, but for applying death with artistic precision." "Exactment, Doctor. A tool calibrated for drops, perfect for painting an invisible film on crystal. Our killer possessed the mind of a conservator. She prepared the surface, applied the medium with uniform thickness, avoided air bubbles, and allowed it to dry completely. A masterwork of technical execution, if not moral purpose." The resolution of each character's fate followed with the inexorable logic of justice served. Professor Hartwell, his scholarly reputation in ruins, submitted his resignation that very morning, confessing in a brief academic paper his failure to properly authenticate the collection. Vincent Carstairs, stripped of his sardonic confidence, acknowledged his unwitting role in providing the killer with perfect cover for her theatrical performance. Miss Ashford closed her notebook with professional satisfaction, already crafting an article that would expose the truth without sensationalizing the tragedy. Pierce approached Poirot with the humble dignity of a man vindicated by truth rather than mere circumstance. "I'm grateful, sir, though I confess the evening has shaken my faith in the certainty of appearances. Your precision and honesty were your salvation, monsieur. A careless servant would have blundered into the trap our killer so carefully prepared. Your very competence protected you from false accusation." As the remaining guests prepared to depart Whitmore House, gathering coats and facing the London night that awaited beyond its elegant facade, Poirot remained by the fireplace, his green eyes reflecting the dying flames. The portrait of the merchant's daughter gazed down upon the scene with renewed serenity, as if the revelation of truth had somehow restored peace to her painted features. The storm outside had finally subsided, leaving only the gentle patter of residual raindrops against the tall windows. Inspector Japp approached with grudging admiration, his gruff manner softened by professional respect. "Another impossible crime made possible by Hercule Poirot's methods," he observed, "though I'll admit the false trail with the frame mechanism had me properly convinced. Remember, mon ami, there are no impossible crimes, only insufficient observation and inadequate reasoning. Lady Margaret created an elaborate puzzle, but every puzzle yields its solution to patience and proper method." Poirot studied the vacant rectangle where the portrait had hung, soon to be, removed under court order and eventually returned to its rightful owners in Vienna. "Art and murder," he murmured thoughtfully, his moustaches bristling with philosophical contemplation. "Both require passion, both demand precision, both leave permanent marks upon the world. But only one serves beauty, while the other serves merely the darkness in the human heart." With characteristic precision, Poirot adjusted his tie, smoothed his moustaches, and prepared to depart Whitmore House. The drawing-room, once the stage for such elaborate deception, now held only the quiet satisfaction that comes from truth revealed and justice properly served. Outside, London awaited with its endless supply of mysteries and human frailties. But tonight's case was closed with the mathematical certainty that had made Hercule Poirot's reputation legendary. The little Belgian detective stepped into the crisp, cleansed air of the London night, leaving behind another triumph of deduction over deception, of order over chaos, of truth over the most sophisticated criminal mind. The portrait and the poison had yielded their secrets to the penetrating gaze of justice, and all was once again right with the world.